The reading today is from an essay by Zishan Aleem, a columnist and editor at MSNBC who also publishes a politics newsletter entitled What's Left? He's kind of a funny guy, I think. In the case for a new kind of atheism, he writes, an organized atheist community can help agitate for and finance a secularist equivalent of the Federalist Society, the right-wing legal movement that helped populate the federal courts with hard-right jurists and helped get us into this mess. To act as a bulwark against theocracy. There has been zero, and I mean zero, innovation in the doctrine of separation of church and state in the last 50 years. Jacques Berliner Brau, a scholar at Georgetown University and the author of Secularism, The Basics, told me. Atheists who consciously believe in their worldview have a particularly urgent interest in helping to lead a legal and political movement to protect against theocracy. At the same time, atheism can address the social and spiritual vacuum emerging in the wake of the slow death of mainstream organized religion. This requires learning from religion, not indiscriminately attacking it, by putting together study groups, communities for secular meditation, and elucidating the meaning and joys of atheism without spewing venom toward all religion. Atheists can build spaces for religion-skeptical people to find purpose, think about ethics, form community, and consider more carefully how to build a better society. He goes on, my personal journey as an atheist, which involved disillusionment with religion and mainstream atheism, is a big part of how I arrived at this idea. It may help to share it. Atheism opened up my world, but it didn't hold it together. I was raised in a Muslim household in the US, but I turned away from Islam in my teens after a fateful conversation with my grandfather one hot summer day in Pakistan. My grandfather was a professor who delighted in thrashing me in chess and asking me vexing questions, and he once posed to me a version of what the Columbia University philosopher Philip Kitcher has called the argument from symmetry. He questioned why I adhered to Islam in particular when so many other religions made claims about the existence of gods, some of them fairly similar to Islam, some radically different. I froze. With no basis on which to distinguish between the validity of these various claims about the supernatural, by definition, I could not know or prove which God was the right one. I quickly confessed that my religiosity was a mere accident of birth. Losing my religion was an unexpected moment of ecstasy. I no longer blamed myself for not understanding the emptiness I had felt when praying to a God. I also felt comfortable interrogating Islam as a vehicle for social conservatism and patriarchy. I knew the claim that a God exists could not be proven or disproven, but I could not believe in one, especially as traditionally understood in the major monotheistic faiths, without evidence or resolution of questions like the problem of evil. And so I became an atheist. Some people, he continued, think of atheists as rudderless and living in a cold, meaningless world. My experience was the opposite. Atheism enlivened me and spurred me to develop a broader skepticism of all manner of received wisdom. The displacement of heaven inspired me to think about achieving utopia on earth. My reading skewed in a radically left-wing direction, and I pivoted toward political activism.
Some of you may have seen that piece by Zishan Aleem. Has anyone read it? Okay, Jim. So it was published just this past Monday, August 1st, on MSNBC. So I do encourage you to go read it. But for those of you who haven't had a chance yet, basically Aleem is laying out his case for what he's calling a new kind of atheism. In the section that Catherine read for us, he articulates how he lost his religion, right? That's his language for it. That question his grandfather asked him, why do you believe this one and not one of the other, thousands of ones? As we heard, that actually felt liberating to Aleem. And he goes on to describe in the piece how he found atheism, but how the new atheism of Christopher Hitchens and others made him uncomfortable. He writes, quote, "On the one hand, I agreed with and learned from some of the new atheist critique of religion as a force for stifling critical thought and purveying social traditionalism. On the other hand, I found that the new atheists caricatured religion and neglected to consider all the nuances of religious belief and the positive role it could play in people's lives." After describing how the new atheists latched on to an anti-Islam position in the post-9/11 world, he writes, quote, "The new atheists also failed to appreciate how religion provides valuable things secular life often fails to find. As I got older, I found myself circling back to the spiritual world, although in an idiosyncratically atheistic manner." So he tells us that he turned to political activism, but that didn't quite give him everything that he was looking for. And then at 29, he wandered into a Quaker meeting house in Manhattan, and somehow that gave him a sense of home that he appreciated. Ultimately, in this piece, what Aleem is proposing is what he calls communitarian atheism. He imagines a kind of community that would appeal to not just atheists, but others with secular and liberal inclinations, that's in quotes. It would be a community of folks who wanted to ensure that religion didn't run politics, but it wouldn't only be for folks who thought religion was awful, but rather for those who understand that, quote, "Religion seeks to answer why we exist and what ethical and social obligations we have. And for people who understand that religion, quote, creates rich, evocative institutions and rituals around these questions. Atheists," he says, "could create intentional communities." And I know I'm quoting a lot, and really, you should just go read it, but it's important to hear the way he phrases these. He says that they could, quote, "form study groups for pursuing the great questions of existence by reading works of literature, philosophy, and yes, even religious texts. They could form secular meditation groups or explore something else that allows for contemplation if meditation's not their cup of tea." He believes that atheists have a unique opportunity to welcome the spiritual nuns, that's those NONESs, that we've been talking about for like a decade or more. So it may come as no shock to you that I, my colleagues, and our colleagues from the ethical culture societies that dot the country all went, has he really never heard of any of us? Does he not understand that the big tent that he writes of, and he uses that phrase, the big tent, the one he imagines might exist for exploring religion and atheism and philosophy and ethics, all while providing those fundamental benefits of religion, does he not realize that already exists and has existed for quite some time? Honestly, every repost I saw of this was like, hey, it's us. We do that thing. The reason Aleem believes we need these communities, why we need us, is because he sees two crises in America. First is what he calls an excess of religion. So he's recognizing that increased fundamentalism on the far right. He cites the Supreme Court and its radicalization, as well as a series of laws that have made fuzzy the separation of church and state. He cites the recent not just overturning of Roe v. Wade, but also those overreaching laws that folks are trying to pass around the country that would make abortion or even miscarriage grounds for charges of homicide. This far-right Christian nationalism, which we've seen both as QAnon, but also in much more sort of run-of-the-mill ways, is leading, he says, to a Christian theocracy in a nation that was never designed to be such. And that, he says, is crisis number one. And while that's happening, there's crisis number 2, which he notes as the downward trend in the participation in organized religion in America. So on the one hand, while this fundamentalist push to gain religious power in various branches of our government, the actual trend among Americans, the people, is abandoning religious institution. He notes that data also suggests that Americans are less involved generally in civic life, not just less involved in religion. And all of this, he says, the detachment from organized religion and the move away from community involvement, all of that is crisis number 2. And so his vision of communitarian atheism would, he thinks, work to ease these crises by involving people in a community so that they gain all the benefits of support and care and inquiry, and also because then it would help them to organize against the religious extremism that is very well funded and has infiltrated every level of government. I think most of us have observed or even fretted or even read endless Pew studies or even spent board retreats talking about these very things. We may even have spent most of our time in ministry hearing about spiritual nuns and what we can do and what it all means. So here's the thing, Aleem's not actually proposing something new, and he's not recognizing new issues. Religious affiliation has been on the decline for a long time, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Good reasons, in many cases. There's been the inherent hypocrisy in many religious traditions, the ties to patriarchy and oppression that make folks uncomfortable, the outright exclusion that has chased many folks out of their familial religious traditions. My generation was more unchurched. I realize the limitations of that word, but that's the word we use for this. It's a convenient one. My generation was more unchurched than my parents' generation, and those that have come after me have largely been even more unchurched. Many of my peers, folks younger than me, never experienced religious community, and they don't actually have a notion of what it is and what they might be missing by not being part of one. And I'll tell you right now, I absolutely believe that the rise in conspiracy theorists, in religious fundamentalism and extremism, in the kind of manic desire to hold on to some fictionalized American society of the past, is absolutely tied to the decline of religious community. It's also, of course, linked to racism and sexism and ageism and a whole mess of other isms. But here's my working notion, right? For millennia, really, religious community and its traditions, the rituals and the markers of time and of change, the care and support it has offered, it gave folks comfort, a place to belong. Of course, for some, it only gave that safety until it didn't, because difference wasn't always welcome. But at its best, religious community is meant to be a way for each of us to be seen and known and affirmed, and also to be made accountable to a visionary way we have of being together. Ultimately, it's meant to help us make meaning from our sometimes chaotic and random and seemingly meaningless lives. Belonging, meaning, accountability, and love within community. That's what religion does. That's what it did when it's being done right. And so when religious affiliation declines, it leaves a vacuum, right? Aleem notes that too, a vacuum where there's supposed to be meaning and belonging. A vacuum where accountability and love should be. And into that vacuum will step any manipulative, power-hungry, savvy person or group or idea. Enter white nationalism, rabid heteronormativity, religious extremism, and more, all trading on the fundamental human longing to belong, to be part of something, to make sense of our ever-changing lives and the struggles we endure. When religion seeds the ground, something else will seed the ground. Something that makes a person feel seen and heard, that makes them feel powerful, something that makes them feel as though they are wanted. The two crises that Aleem articulates are absolutely intertwined with each other and with a whole host of other societal trends we could call crises that we've seen play out over these past decades. We have a collective fixation on fame, and the expansion of the internet brings this notion that anyone and everyone can achieve it and that the human cost doesn't matter, that hurting others or acting unethically is fine if it's in service of our own likes and acclaim. There's the perpetuation of the falsehood of the American dream based in meritocracy and all the absolute nonsense that goes along with it. If I made it, so can anyone, right? This idea that somehow our system really is fair and just when it patently isn't so. And then that attendant refusal to actually make any change. There's been a massive backlash of racism and sexism and anti-LGBTQ over the past half century. Even as we've made wonderful progress in some ways, there are factions that dig in their heels harder every year. And even now, we see how the safety and liberty and autonomy of so many of our human family are at risk. There's the unbelievable wealth disparity that has rendered the notion of home ownership or even retirement basically a farce for anyone of my generation or younger than me, unless you're lucky enough to receive an inheritance of generational wealth. There have been absurd trends in the cost of living without upward trends in pay. A statistic came out recently about the cost of living in most cities in America. And there's a $15 minimum wage in many cities where to actually live and rent a home would require making closer to $40 an hour. These decades have seen the intensification of the climate crisis and the lack of collective action that tells the story of a society that cares only about right now. There's a terrifying unwillingness to make real change because it would be hard or inconvenient. And of course, all of these trends are knitted together. And part, I think, of what's so worrying is that many of them are really just founded in an individualistic, greedy vision of this moment. Right now, what can I gain? How can I benefit? What am I holding at bay because I'm afraid? What am I holding on to because change is too hard? What is mine? That's really the overarching trend, an extreme version of American individualism that is fearful of scarcity and embraces greed. And so, religion at its best is countercultural. At its best, it works to reframe from the individual to the community. It works to frame the inevitable change we will experience. And more than that even, it tries to give that change meaning. Religion at its best can do the hard work of contextualizing change and loss and struggle and making life and all its hardship not just livable, but joyful and wondrous and enlivening. I know sometimes it can feel like we talk a lot here about what's broken, what's hard, what needs fixing, those societal trends that we're trying to work against. And that's true, we do talk about it a lot, because it turns out that's actually part of the point of religious community. That our shared mission and vision, our shared covenant, our purpose for gathering is to ask the hard questions about ethics and philosophy, to plumb the depths of literature and commentary and sacred text and poetry. It's to support and care for one another. It's to remind each other that hope is real, and also it's to tell the truth. So yeah, often we do talk about the hard stuff because it's the true stuff, and it matters to say it out loud, to acknowledge it in this moment, to bear witness to what is really real in our lives and in our shared world. And I hope, that by naming it, we actually make it a little bit less scary. Because then we also share our hopes and our thoughtful reflections and our prayers and our encouragement to each other that change is really possible. Here, what we do, this thing we already do that Aleem wants to create, it matters. Sometimes even I can forget that, get lost in the business of being an institution or in the seductive quality of life beyond these walls. But it really does matter. This community, at its best, is countercultural, just as a religious institution should be. This is a place for people to ask big questions and share their big answers without fear. It's a place for our children to talk about who they are and what they're struggling with and feel supported in their lives. It's a place where, when we are at our best, We can fight against not only the crises that Aleem notes, but all those other ones we know are right outside the doors. Here, we can build strength to take on the challenges of this moment in our shared world. But there's one thing. The one thing is we can't do it if we aren't actually fundamentally creating loving community together. If we're drawing lines between our elders and our children, it won't work. If we're drawing lines between those whose lives have allowed them to step into leadership in a certain way and those whose lives don't allow such things, it won't work. For it to work, for the congregation to thrive, for religious institutions to thrive, for people to be seen and known and held, for us to move forward together, creating the world we truly want to live in, we have to be open-hearted, open-minded, forgiving, willing to change, and willing to hold each other through that change. We have to be in this moment, but not stuck here, not unmoving and unyielding, our head turned always toward the past. We have to be in this moment, knowing that the next moment is right there and right there and right there, and that we have no choice but to move ahead. We have to be willing to take risks and make sacrifices and do things again and just try, without worrying about what anyone else is or isn't doing. We have to be here, present to each other, filled with love. The big tent for theological diversity, civic engagement, philosophical and ethical conversation, and changing the world through activism already exists. It is us. We are here. We are doing it. But it matters that Aleem didn't even mention us. It's important information for us. So maybe, just maybe, the other thing we have to do is stop being so quiet. We need to tell people who we are, why what we do matters, how this is a place of joy and love and affirmation. We need to be out there, sharing ourselves, offering love to the world, shouting from the rooftops that this right here is a forward-looking countercultural movement with a long history that has the potential to change everything. So that's where I am in August. Looking at the world as it is, remembering where we have come from, understanding where we are falling short, and remembering just exactly why it is that we show up here over and over again. That's where I am, trying to understand better how we show and tell and proclaim to the world our existence, letting the world know all the benefits of intentional, beloved, supportive, change-making, truth-telling community. In this moment, this is where I am, here with you, finding our way, doing what we do, creating more love. May we never stop seeking our best selves and a better world, and may we never stop sharing what we have learned. So may it be.